Welcome to Sleepy Crime. Before we begin tonight's case, I'd love to know where are you watching from right now. I'm always amazed to see these stories reach people from all over the world. And if you enjoy these quiet, late-night dives into true crime, make sure you like this video and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Now, take a moment to settle in. Whether you're lying in bed, wrapped in a blanket, or sitting in a dimly lit room with your headphones on, let the outside world fade. Let your breathing slow. Let your shoulders loosen. Tonight's story is meant to be heard in the calm of the night, where nothing feels rushed and every detail unfolds at its own pace. This isn't the kind of story that shouts. It whispers. It starts with a letter, the kind that once promised hope, romance, and a better life. Back in the days when lonely men and women looked for love through newspaper ads, before dating apps and instant messages, there was something almost innocent about the process. You wrote to a stranger. You waited for their reply. You imagined a future together before you'd even heard their voice. But sometimes, those letters were written by people who weren't looking for love at all. They were hunting. And in the late 1940s, two names would become forever linked to the dark side of Lonely Hearts ads, Raymond Fernández and Martha Beck. To the outside world, they were a couple hopelessly devoted to each other. Behind closed doors, they were something else entirely, a partnership built on lies, jealousy, and murder. Let's begin. It began, as so many stories of love and deceit did in the 1940s, with a Lonely Hearts advertisement in the back pages of a newspaper. These ads were often small, tucked between classifieds for used furniture and announcements about church socials. They didn't need to be large, just a few carefully chosen words, a hint of personality, and an invitation to correspond. For people who lived in small towns or who felt isolated, they were a lifeline. In a time before television was in every home, before phones were common, and long before the internet, the idea of romance through the written word felt intimate, almost magical. Raymond Fernández had learned long ago how to turn that intimacy into an opportunity. Born in Hawaii to Puerto Rican parents, he had spent part of his youth in Puerto Rico before making his way to the mainland United States. Life had never been particularly kind to him. He was a slight man, with a receding hairline and intense dark eyes, but what he lacked in conventional handsomeness, he more than made up for in charm. He knew how to listen, how to flatter, and, most importantly, how to make his letters feel personal, as though the woman reading them was the only person in the world who truly mattered to him. Raymond's skill at seduction had been sharpened not only by natural charisma but by necessity. He had spent time in prison, and while serving his sentence he developed an almost academic interest in psychology and the power of persuasion. He read books on human behavior and discovered that the right combination of flattery, attention, and feigned vulnerability could lower a person's defenses remarkably quickly. By the time he was released, he wasn't just a man looking for a job. He was a man who knew how to manipulate emotions with surgical precision. One of his favorite hunting grounds was the Lonely Hearts section. A few words in print could bring him dozens of responses, and from those letters, he could sift through potential victims. Some women simply wanted companionship and would write to him for weeks without ever meeting him. Others had savings or property, and it was these women who interested him most. His method was simple: establish trust through correspondence, arrange to meet in person, sweep them off their feet with an intense display of affection. And then, once they were convinced they had found love, find a way to access their money. Sometimes he would marry them briefly, sometimes he would just convince them to invest in some fictional opportunity. Then he would disappear. In early 1947, one of Raymond's ads found its way into the hands of Martha Beck, a lonely nurse from Florida. Martha's life had been marked by disappointment. She had grown up overweight and deeply insecure about her appearance, subjected to cruel teasing from classmates and even, at times, from her own family. She dreamed of romance, of being cherished. But her relationships had been fleeting and unsatisfying. A brief marriage had ended in failure, leaving her a single mother with 2 young children, and a job that paid the bills but offered little in the way of excitement. When she read Raymond's letter, warm, attentive, filled with compliments, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Here was a man who seemed genuinely interested in her, who wrote not just about himself but about her life, her thoughts, her dreams. He asked questions and remembered the details of her answers. He sent more letters, each one arriving like a small burst of sunshine in her otherwise predictable days. She began to wait eagerly for the mail, her heart lifting whenever she saw his familiar handwriting on the envelope. Raymond, for his part, had quickly recognized that Martha was different from many of the women he corresponded with. She was emotionally vulnerable, eager for affection, and willing to believe in the fantasy he was weaving. But she also had a possessive streak. In her letters, there was a hint of jealousy when he spoke about other women, even in casual, passing ways. For most men, that might have been a red flag, but for Raymond, it was a signal. A woman who feared losing him was a woman who could be controlled. Their first meeting took place after weeks of letters. Raymond traveled to Florida, arriving with the kind of flourish Martha had only seen in movies. He brought gifts, spoke in soft, romantic tones, and made her feel as though she had stepped into the pages of a love story. She was smitten almost instantly. Within days, she was imagining a future with him, and when he spoke of marriage in vague but persuasive terms, she believed it was only a matter of time. What Martha didn't know was that she was already part of Raymond's ongoing con. He had no intention of settling down with her in the way she imagined. His plan was to take what he could, then move on to the next lonely heart. But something happened that he hadn't planned for. Martha refused to be discarded. When he tried to distance himself, she followed. When he returned to New York, she showed up at his door. And when she discovered that he had other women in his life, women who were not just pen pals, but marks in his elaborate schemes, she didn't leave. Instead, she made a choice that would bind them together in a way neither could have predicted. Martha told Raymond that if he truly loved her, he would stop pretending with other women. But she didn't mean he should stop the scams entirely. Instead, she proposed that they work together. She could pose as his sister, she suggested, which would make women less suspicious when he appeared with another woman in tow. She would handle the domestic side of things, cook meals, keep house, and support him in whatever way was needed. In return, he would keep her close and keep other women from threatening her place in his life. For Raymond, it was an unusual but intriguing offer. Martha's presence might complicate certain seductions, but it could also be useful. She was fiercely loyal, and her jealousy meant she was unlikely to betray him. And so, an unholy alliance was formed. No longer just a conman and a woman in love, they became partners in crime. Their early ventures together followed a familiar pattern. Raymond would continue to place Lonely Hearts ads and correspond with women who responded. Once a potential victim seemed promising, financially stable, lonely, and trusting, he and Martha would arrange to meet her. Martha's role was to disarm suspicion by playing the role of a harmless relative. In some cases, this ruse was enough to get what they wanted without violence. In others, things took a darker turn. By the time 1948 began, the pair had left a trail of deception across several states. Most of their victims were women who had been searching for companionship and found only betrayal. But Raymond, and Martha weren't content with small gains. The more they succeeded, the bolder they became. And soon, their crimes would escalate far beyond fraud. It was a single letter that had brought them together, a piece of paper covered in carefully chosen words. But it was their shared willingness to exploit love, and their growing dependence on each other, that would transform them from a con artist and a lonely nurse into something far more dangerous. What began in ink and sentiment was already, in those early days, edging toward blood. To understand how Raymond Fernández became the man who could look into a stranger's eyes and, within days, convince her that she was the love of his life, you have to go back to the very beginning, to a boy growing up between cultures shaped by hardship, and slowly learning that trust was a currency more valuable than money. Raymond was born in Hawaii in 1914 to Puerto Rican parents. His early years were not those of a child with stability or comfort. When he was still young, his family returned to Puerto Rico, where life was marked by limited opportunity and hard physical work. From an early age, Raymond learned how to adapt, how to read a person's mood, how to say what someone wanted to hear, and how to turn charm into a survival tool. His family was strict, but not wealthy, and as a boy he quickly realized that the world responded better to a well-placed smile than to a demand. By the time he was in his late teens, Raymond was already restless. Puerto Rico offered few chances for someone with his ambitions, and in 1932 he left for the United States. He was drawn by the same dream that had pulled so many before him, the idea that in America you could become anything. But reality was harsher. Work was hard to find, especially for an immigrant with limited English and no connections. He did odd jobs, some in construction, some in shipping, but he never seemed to settle anywhere for long. The first real turning point in his life came when he joined the Merchant Marines. This work took him across oceans, exposed him to new cultures, and gave him a sense of sophistication that he later used to impress people. At sea, he learned to carry himself with confidence, to speak just enough about exotic places to seem worldly, and to hold his own in conversations with men who had lived far rougher lives than his. But it was also during this time that Raymond began to develop a taste for small cons, harmless at first, like selling trinkets to locals at inflated prices, but later more calculated, testing how far he could push someone's trust without losing it entirely. When the Second World War began, Raymond saw another opportunity to reinvent himself. He enlisted in the U.S. Army and served in intelligence-related work, though his exact duties were never entirely clear. He presented himself as someone of importance, someone with skills that ordinary men didn't have. In truth, what the military gave him wasn't so much specialized training as it was discipline, structure, and a sharper sense of human nature. But the warriors also brought an event that would change him forever. In 1945, while serving in Asia, Raymond was injured when a steel hatch fell on his head. The blow fractured his skull and reportedly damaged his frontal lobe, the part of the brain that influences impulse control, judgment, and social behavior. Whether the injury truly transformed his personality or simply magnified traits that were already there, those who knew him after the accident often described him as different, more volatile, more willing to take risks, and more comfortable bending moral boundaries. It was a subtle but important shift, and in the years to come, it would play out in dangerous ways. After his discharge, Raymond moved to Spain for a brief period. There, he claimed to have studied voodoo not as a religion, but as a means of understanding how ritual and superstition could influence people's minds. Whether this was entirely true or part of the mythology he later built around himself, it fit the persona he liked to project, a man of mystery, with knowledge beyond the ordinary. It was also in Spain that he began to refine the tactics he would later use on his victims. He discovered that presenting himself as exotic, foreign, and just a little enigmatic made people more curious, more willing to listen, and more likely to trust his stories. By the time he returned to the United States in the late 1940s, Raymond had all the ingredients he needed to become the Lonely Hearts predator. He had the self-assurance of a man who had seen the world, the manipulative instincts of someone who had been practicing deception for years, and the cold calculation of a man who saw relationships not as emotional bonds, but as opportunities. He was also increasingly convinced that he was smarter than the people around him, that he could take what he wanted without facing serious consequences. His first known cons after returning to the U.S. involved small-scale frauds. He would answer Lonely Hearts ads placed by women, often widows or spinsters, and present himself as a romantic prospect. The courtship would move quickly, and soon he would be staying in their homes, borrowing money or persuading them to invest in imaginary ventures. In some cases, he would marry these women, only to disappear days or weeks later, leaving them not just heartbroken but financially ruined. The brilliance of Raymond's approach was in how ordinary it looked from the outside. To neighbors, he seemed like any other suitor. To the women themselves, he was attentive, charming, and devoted. He would cook for them, listen to their stories, and make small gestures that made them feel special. It was only later, when the money was gone and Raymond had vanished, that the illusion fell apart. What set Raymond apart from other conmen of the era was his ability to adapt to each woman's personality. He could be soft-spoken and gentle with someone timid, or bold and flirtatious with someone more outgoing. He paid close attention to the little things, a passing comment about a childhood dream, a mention of a deceased spouse, and later used them to build a sense of intimacy. This wasn't just theft. It was theater, and Raymond was the lead actor in a play that ended with him walking away richer, while his co-star was left in ruins. But even the most skilled predators have their weaknesses. For Raymond, it was a combination of ego and restlessness. He enjoyed the thrill of the con, the rush of pulling it off, but he was always looking for the next score. That meant he often left behind loose ends, people who might talk, inconsistencies in his stories, and eventually traces that police could follow. For years, he managed to stay ahead of any real consequences. He moved frequently, used aliases, and charmed his way out of suspicion. But by 1947, his life was about to take a turn he hadn't anticipated. When he began corresponding with Martha Beck, she seemed at first like just another potential mark. She was lonely, financially stable enough to be worth the trouble, and eager for affection. But Raymond quickly discovered that Martha was unlike any woman he had met before. She didn't just want his attention, she demanded it. She didn't flinch when she learned he had been seeing other women. Instead, she proposed joining him. In Martha, Raymond found something unusual, a partner who was not only willing to overlook his cons but actively participate in them. She brought a kind of devotion he had never experienced, one that was intense, consuming, and, in its own way, as dangerous as his own schemes. Together, they would become something neither could have been alone, a team that blended manipulation, seduction, and violence in a way that would shock the country. And it all began with the man Raymond Fernández had become by the time they met, a charming predator, honed by years of practice, armed with an understanding of human nature, and utterly unburdened by conscience. If Raymond Fernández was the architect of their crimes, Martha Beck was the cement that held them together, fiercely loyal, emotionally intense, and willing to destroy anyone she perceived as a threat to their relationship. To understand how she became that person, you have to look at a life shaped by rejection, humiliation, and a desperate need to belong. Martha Jewel Seabrook was born in Milton, Florida, in 1920. From the very beginning, she felt different, and not in a way that made her stand out positively. She was a large baby and, as she grew, remained overweight throughout her childhood. In an era when appearance was often equated with a woman's worth, this made her an easy target for ridicule. Classmates teased her relentlessly, and the cruelty of other children left deep scars on her self-esteem. She often withdrew into her own imagination, crafting fantasies of love and acceptance that were far removed from the reality she lived in. Her home life was no refuge from the harshness of the outside world. Accounts suggest that Martha's mother was cold and critical, often reinforcing the idea that her daughter would never attract a man because of her size. Her father, when present, offered little comfort or protection. As a result, Martha grew up starved for affection, clinging to any sign of kindness, no matter how fleeting or insincere. She learned early that love in her life would not come easily, and when she did find it, she would have to fight to keep it. Martha was intelligent and ambitious enough to imagine a better life for herself, and after finishing high school, she enrolled in nursing school. It was one of the few professions at the time that offered women independence, a steady income, and a sense of purpose. But even here, she found herself an outsider. Fellow students sometimes excluded her from social gatherings, and she remained painfully aware of how others saw her. She compensated by working hard, excelling in her studies, and projecting an air of confidence she didn't always feel. After completing her training, Martha found work as a nurse for a children's hospital. She was good at her job, competent, dependable, and compassionate toward her patients. But while her professional life was stable, her personal life remained turbulent. She longed for marriage and a family, but her relationships were brief and often ended in disappointment. Men would date her casually but rarely commit, and each rejection deepened her fear that she was destined to be alone. In 1944, she had what seemed like a breakthrough when she met and married a bus driver named Alfred Beck. For a brief time, it appeared she had found the security she had always wanted. She gave birth to 2 children in quick succession, a son and a daughter, and for a moment, her life seemed on track. But the marriage unraveled almost as quickly as it began. Alfred proved to be unreliable and unfaithful, and after a short and unhappy union, the couple divorced. The end of her marriage left Martha in a precarious position, a single mother in a conservative small town, working long hours to support her children and fending off gossip about her failed relationship. She began to retreat even further into her fantasies, often imagining a perfect man who would arrive in her life and rescue her from loneliness. That man would love her unconditionally, accept her children, and protect her from the harshness of the outside world. She knew he might not exist, but the hope of finding him became a driving force in her life. By the mid-1940s, Martha began reading the Lonely Hearts sections of newspapers. These ads, placed by men and women seeking companionship, offered a small glimmer of possibility. For someone like Martha, they were more than personal ads, they were invitations to dream. She answered a few, sometimes exchanging letters for weeks, but most of the men she corresponded with either lost interest or made it clear they weren't looking for anything serious. Each failed exchange felt like another rejection, and yet she kept trying. In early 1947, one of those letters arrived from a man named Raymond Fernández. His words were unlike any she had received before, warm, attentive, and deeply personal. He seemed genuinely interested in her life, her work, and her dreams. He wrote with the polish of someone who had seen the world, sprinkling in references to his travels and experiences that made him seem exotic and sophisticated. For Martha, who had spent her entire life in small southern towns, Raymond was a glimpse of something larger and more exciting than she had ever known. As their correspondence deepened, Martha began to believe that she had finally found the man she had been waiting for. She told friends and colleagues about him, sometimes embellishing details to make their romance sound even more sweeping. When Raymond suggested meeting in person, she agreed without hesitation. In her mind, this was the beginning of her new life. Their first meeting only reinforced her conviction. Raymond arrived with gifts, charm, and a kind of attentiveness that Martha had never experienced from a man before. He looked directly into her eyes when he spoke, asked about her children, and made her feel beautiful, something she had rarely felt in her life. By the end of his visit, she was completely captivated. But when Raymond returned to New York and began to pull away, Martha's reaction was not to let him go. Instead, she clung tighter. She sent more letters, called when she could, and eventually traveled to see him. When she discovered that he was involved with other women, her reaction was not outrage in the way most might expect. Instead, she saw it as a problem to be solved. She confronted him, not to demand that he stop his cons, but to demand that he let her be part of them. This was the turning point. Martha proposed becoming his partner, offering to pose as his sister to help him gain the trust of other women. She promised loyalty, secrecy, and total commitment. For Raymond, this was an unexpected but welcome development. Martha's presence would make his schemes more believable, and her devotion meant he didn't have to worry about her betraying him. From that moment on, Martha's life changed completely. She left her job, abandoned her children, sending them to live with a friend, and devoted herself entirely to Raymond. In her mind, this was not just love, it was destiny. She had spent her life searching for someone who would make her feel wanted, and now that she had found him, she would do anything to keep him. That willingness would soon be tested in ways neither of them could have imagined. Because, while their partnership began with small cons and emotional manipulation, it was already inching toward something darker, a path that would turn the desperate heart of Martha Beck into one half of one of the most notorious killing duos of the 20th century. When Raymond Fernández and Martha Beck officially joined forces, it was not the kind of partnership built on equal footing. Raymond remained the strategist, the man with the blueprint for the con, while Martha became the enforcer of loyalty, both to him and to their plan. Yet in this new arrangement, something dangerous emerged. Martha was not content to simply help Raymond trick women out of their money. Her devotion came with an intensity that brooked no competition, and that intensity would soon escalate the stakes of their crimes. Their early schemes followed a predictable pattern. Raymond would comb through the Lonely Hearts sections of various newspapers, looking for ads from women who seemed isolated, financially secure, and emotionally vulnerable. Once he selected a target, he would write her a carefully crafted letter. His style was deliberate, warm, complimentary, but never overly romantic at first. He allowed the relationship to build gradually through correspondence, feeding the woman just enough attention to spark her interest while planting subtle hints about his charm, worldliness, and longing for a genuine connection. When the woman seemed sufficiently invested, he would propose a meeting. This was where Martha came in. Introducing her as his sister served two purposes. First, it disarmed the woman's natural suspicion. A man traveling with his sister seemed trustworthy, grounded, and far less likely to have ulterior motives. Second, it allowed Martha to observe the target closely, sizing her up, and quietly asserting her own presence in Raymond's life. She would make small, calculated remarks to remind the woman that she and Raymond were close, inseparable, even. For the first few months of their partnership, the cons remained focused on financial gain. Raymond would convince the women to give him money for invented business ventures, or to lend him sums for supposed emergencies. Sometimes he would go so far as to marry them in small ceremonies, only to vanish soon after with whatever cash or valuables he could carry. Martha proved herself an asset during these encounters, not only lending credibility to Raymond's persona but also helping to manage the emotional manipulation. She could be friendly and even warm to the victims, but if she sensed any spark of romantic competition, her demeanor shifted. Her smile would harden, her eyes narrowing just enough to convey a quiet warning. It was in the late summer of 1947 that their crimes took their first irrevocable step toward violence. The exact circumstances of that shift remain debated, but what is clear is that their partnership was no longer content with leaving victims merely heartbroken and broke. One of their early targets during this period was a widow living in Pennsylvania. She had placed an ad in a New York paper, describing herself as lonely but hopeful, and Raymond had responded with his usual charm. By the time he and Martha arrived at her home, the widow was smitten. She welcomed them both as honored guests. Over the course of their stay, Raymond began to extract money from her, small amounts at first, then larger sums. Martha, however, grew restless. She viewed the woman not just as a mark, but as a rival for Raymond's attention. The thought of leaving her alive to possibly expose their scheme was unacceptable to her. This was the moment when the balance of their crimes began to tip. Whether Raymond initiated the idea or simply agreed to it, the result was the same. The woman did not survive their visit. Her death was officially attributed to natural causes, but whispers of something more sinister began to follow the pair in the towns they passed through. From there, the line between con and murder became increasingly blurred. In some cases, the victims were women who resisted giving money or began to suspect Raymond's motives. In others, they were women who posed no threat but had the misfortune of attracting too much of his attention, igniting Martha's jealousy. The killings were rarely elaborate. They were pragmatic, designed to eliminate witnesses or potential problems. Yet there was also an undercurrent of personal emotion in some of them, particularly in the way Martha treated the victims she saw as romantic competition. Their methods varied. Sometimes the deaths appeared to be accidents. Other times they were staged as suicides. In at least one instance, the victim was poisoned. In another, she was strangled. Raymond's role in the killings often leaned toward the practical, ensuring that the deaths left as little trace as possible, while Martha's involvement carried a more emotional edge. Her motivation was not just to protect their scheme, but to protect her claim on Raymond, to make sure no other woman could take her place. The pair's mobility made them difficult to track. They crisscrossed the eastern United States, using different names, leaving behind just enough confusion in each community to avoid immediate suspicion. By the time local authorities began piecing together what had happened to one victim, Raymond and Martha were already hundreds of miles away, charming a new woman in a new town. Their crimes spanned not only state lines but emotional boundaries that most people could never imagine crossing. For a time, their ability to evade capture seemed almost uncanny. They blended into the post-war landscape, just another man and his sister traveling together, sometimes visiting friends, sometimes looking for work. The sheer ordinariness of their appearances was their greatest disguise. And yet, despite their apparent success, the pair was not immune to mistakes. The more women they targeted, the greater the risk of drawing attention. Neighbors noticed strange comings and goings. Family members of victims began asking questions. And though police work in the late 1940s lacked the tools of modern forensics, patterns were starting to emerge. Even as the noose slowly tightened, Raymond and Martha pressed forward, seemingly convinced that their luck would hold. In their minds, they were not just lovers, but co-conspirators bound by an unshakable trust. They shared everything: meals, beds, plans, and increasingly, the burden of the lives they had taken. Each crime seemed to reinforce their bond, as though the shared secrecy made them more indispensable to each other. It was this unyielding commitment, more than any brilliance in their planning, that allowed them to continue. Martha had abandoned her children, her home, and her career for this life, and she was not about to let it go. Raymond had found a partner who demanded absolute devotion yet offered unwavering loyalty in return. Together, they had crossed a line that neither could retreat from, and from this point on, every victim was another step deeper into a darkness they no longer feared. But, as they would soon discover, no amount of charm or cunning could erase the traces they left behind, traces that, slowly but inevitably, were beginning to point toward the so-called Lonely Hearts Killers. By the late 1940s, the name Raymond Fernández was not yet infamous, but in certain pockets of the eastern United States, he was becoming a ghostly figure in whispers, a man who charmed women, took their money, and vanished. It was not only the money that puzzled those who began to notice the pattern, but the fact that some of these women were never seen again. And in each of those cases, there were peculiar details that, at the time, seemed isolated, unconnected, but when placed side by side began to tell a story. The post-war years were a time when law enforcement in small towns often operated in isolation, with little communication between jurisdictions. A woman disappearing in Pennsylvania was not immediately connected to a similar disappearance in New York or New Jersey. There were no national databases, no instant fingerprint matches. If a local sheriff suspected foul play but had no body and no immediate evidence of a crime, the case might fade into the background. This was precisely the environment that allowed Raymond and Martha to operate with such brazen confidence. Their pattern was deceptively simple. It began with an ad in a Lonely Hearts column, sometimes placed by the woman, sometimes by Raymond himself under an alias. He would strike up correspondence, weaving a narrative of shared dreams and future plans. He rarely presented himself as wealthy, but always as stable, dependable, and eager to settle down. The presence of his sister, Martha, added a veneer of respectability that soothed the suspicions of even the most cautious women. Once trust was established, Raymond and Martha would visit the woman, often staying for days or even weeks. They ingratiated themselves not just with the intended victim, but with her friends, neighbors, and sometimes even family members. In many cases, they were given a guest room, shared meals, and treated as though they already belonged. This intimacy made it all the more shocking and harder to accept when the woman vanished shortly after their departure. One such case occurred in late 1948 in Michigan. A widow in her early 50s, known for her careful nature and reluctance to remarry, had nevertheless been corresponding with a man she described to friends as a gentleman traveler. When she suddenly left town allegedly to marry him, her neighbors were puzzled but not alarmed. She sent a letter a week later, explaining she was happy and starting a new life. That was the last anyone heard from her. Months later, her home was sold under suspicious circumstances, the proceeds quietly disappearing. In another instance, in Ohio, a younger woman was found dead in what was initially ruled an accidental fall. She had been hosting a visiting brother and sister in her home for nearly 2 weeks. The local coroner's report was vague, but friends of the woman were unsettled by the fact that certain valuables had gone missing and that her supposed guests had vanished overnight without leaving a forwarding address. It was these inconsistencies, money disappearing, homes changing hands, valuables gone, that began to catch the attention of more astute investigators. In a few cases, relatives of the victims pushed local police to dig deeper. Some managed to uncover the names used by Raymond and Martha during their visits, but these were often false identities. Still, a faint outline was forming: a dark-haired man with a foreign accent, a heavy-set woman claiming to be his sister, and a trail of women who ended up penniless, missing, or dead. By early 1949, the pair had expanded their reach. They traveled under various aliases, moving from the northeast into the Midwest and occasionally dipping southward. They were careful to avoid revisiting towns where they might be recognized, but their confidence was growing. In some cases, Raymond would juggle multiple correspondences at once, arranging meetings with women in different states within weeks of each other. This constant movement created an overlapping chain of victims, each unaware that there were others like her. The growing pattern was not only a matter of geography but of psychology. Investigators who later studied the case noted that Raymond's letters to his victims followed strikingly similar arcs. The early messages were cautious, even formal, establishing credibility. Then came subtle flattery, carefully designed to make the woman feel seen and valued. Once an emotional bond was established, practical matters entered the conversation, suggestions of pooling resources, investments, or the possibility of marriage. By the time money was exchanged or travel was arranged, the woman was often convinced she was building a future, and Raymond's role as the charming suitor was firmly cemented. Martha's role in maintaining the pattern was just as crucial. She managed the domestic facade, often helping with cooking, cleaning, or tending to small household tasks during their visits. This not only ingratiated her with the victims but allowed her to keep a close watch over their interactions with Raymond. If she sensed any hesitation, she would apply her own form of pressure, sometimes through subtle guilt, sometimes through overt emotional manipulation. But as the months passed, the pair began to grow careless. In one case, a neighbor in a small Illinois town became suspicious when she saw the visiting couple loading several suitcases into their car late at night, only hours before their host was found dead. In another, a bank teller remembered the woman, who had come in with a heavyset female companion, to withdraw a large sum of cash just days before she disappeared. These were small details, but they began to circulate in local gossip and eventually in police reports. Still, the lack of centralized communication kept Raymond and Martha just ahead of the law. They understood that small-town police forces were limited in manpower and resources, and they exploited this at every turn. By the time one jurisdiction realized they had been duped, the pair was already 2 or 3 states away, working on their next victim. The pattern, however, was no longer invisible. By mid-1949, several police departments in New York, Michigan, and Illinois had begun comparing notes. The description of the man and his sister was alarmingly consistent. There was talk of creating a task force, though it would take months before such efforts would gain traction. What Raymond and Martha didn't realize, or perhaps didn't want to admit to themselves, was that their crimes had reached a point where they could no longer simply blend into the background. The trail they left was not just made of broken hearts and empty bank accounts. It was made of people who had loved and trusted them, people whose sudden disappearances could not be explained away forever. And somewhere in the web of newspaper ads, false names, and staged goodbyes, a loose thread was waiting to be pulled, a thread that, once tugged, would unravel everything they had built. By the summer of 1949, the reach of Raymond Fernández and Martha Beck had grown so wide that it was only a matter of time before their luck began to fray. They had moved through state after state, leaving behind a string of deceived, bereft, and in some cases dead women. Each crime in isolation looked like an unfortunate but unconnected tragedy. A sudden illness, a questionable accident, or disappearance explained away by a romantic elopement. But slowly, in police stations scattered across the Northeast and Midwest, detectives began to notice a troubling repetition in the details. The break came not from a large-scale manhunt, but from a single case that refused to fade quietly into obscurity. In late 1949, a woman named Delphine Downing in Michigan became one of their targets. She was a young widow with a 2-year-old daughter, lonely and open to the possibility of companionship. Raymond, under one of his many aliases, had charmed her through letters, promising stability, affection, and a shared future. When he and Martha arrived, presenting themselves once again as devoted siblings, Delphine welcomed them into her home. For several days, life in the Downing household seemed almost idyllic to the untrained eye. Raymond played the role of attentive suitor, while Martha assumed a domestic role, helping with cooking and even playing with Delphine's little girl. But beneath this veneer, tension simmered. Delphine, though flattered by Raymond's attention, had moments of hesitation. She confided in a neighbor that something about the situation felt off, though she could not explain exactly why. It was during this visit that the couple made a critical mistake, one that would ultimately begin the unraveling of their scheme. According to later testimony, an argument broke out between Delphine and Raymond after she confronted him about inconsistencies in his stories. The confrontation escalated, and at some point Delphine's daughter became distressed, crying inconsolably. To quiet her, Martha administered sleeping pills, a move she would later claim was meant only to calm the child but which would play heavily into the horrific events that followed. Delphine, now increasingly uneasy, considered ending the visit. But she never got the chance. The official story pieced together later suggested that Martha, driven by jealousy and fear that Delphine would expose them, pressured Raymond into eliminating her. Delphine was shot in the head at close range while her daughter slept in the next room. Rather than flee immediately, the pair stayed in the house 4 days, tending to the child and attempting to maintain a facade in case neighbors came by. This decision, to linger instead of disappearing, was their second major mistake. It gave the local community time to notice inconsistencies, like the fact that Delphine had not been seen outside her home and that visitors had taken her place in daily routines. It also increased the risk of being spotted by someone who could later identify them. When they finally decided to leave, they took the girl with them. What happened next was grim and decisive. Fearing that the child would become a witness or be used to track them down, they killed her as well. The brutality of murdering a 2-year-old was something that even seasoned investigators would later struggle to comprehend, and it marked a new low in their already chilling history. The bodies of both mother and daughter were left in the house, concealed but not hidden well enough to avoid discovery. When neighbors eventually entered the Downing home, the scene they found was disturbing and suspicious enough to prompt immediate police involvement. Within hours, the local sheriff's department launched an investigation, which quickly revealed that Delphine had been corresponding with a man before her death. They discovered letters, photographs, and even some of the false identities Raymond had used. For the first time, law enforcement had tangible leads that connected the dots between this murder and other unexplained cases in nearby states. The case drew the attention of the Michigan State Police, who began working with other departments to see if similar incidents had occurred elsewhere. This collaboration, still rare for the time, started to produce results. A name from one state matched a description from another. The same brother and sister story was being told in at least 4 separate jurisdictions. Bank records from Ohio, Illinois, and New York revealed withdrawals or transfers made shortly before the deaths or disappearances of women who matched the victim profile. Meanwhile, Raymond and Martha, unaware of how much heat they had attracted, continued to operate. They moved east, seeking new marks, but the pressure was building. Reports of their description were quietly circulated between departments. One detective in New York, upon hearing about the Downing case, recalled an unsolved disappearance from the year before that involved a similar couple. The cumulative effect of these shared details was like a slow tide rising, not a dramatic breakthrough, but an inevitable encirclement. Their arrogance, however, led them to take yet another risk. They answered an ad from a woman in New York named Jeanne F. a 66-year-old widow with a comfortable savings account. She was deeply religious and cautious by nature, but Raymond's letters had reassured her of his sincerity. When she invited him to visit, she expected courtship, perhaps even a proposal. Instead, she met both Raymond and Martha, who once again played the role of the protective sister. What happened in Jeanette's home would seal their fate. Within days of their arrival, Jeanette was dead, strangled after what Martha later described as an argument. The couple hastily moved her body to another location, but this time the cover-up was sloppy. Jeanette's sudden disappearance raised immediate alarm among her friends, and her bank account, recently accessed, pointed directly to her last known visitors. By now, the coordination between states was far enough along that descriptions and aliases could be cross-referenced. Witnesses from multiple towns confirmed that the couple traveling together was the same in each incident. The Downing murders had given law enforcement the push they needed to pursue them aggressively, and John Fay's case provided the final, damning link. For Raymond and Martha, the net was closing fast. They still believed, perhaps naively, that they could stay one step ahead, but what they didn't realize was that the luxury of anonymity they had enjoyed for years was gone. Their names, faces, and methods were no longer whispers. They were becoming headlines. In early 1949, just weeks after the murder of Jean Fay, the trail of Raymond Fernández and Martha Beck had grown hotter than ever before. For years, they had moved like shadows through the Lonely Hearts columns, slipping in and out of towns without leaving enough evidence to bind them to their crimes. But now the circumstances had changed. They had left too many threads dangling, too many witnesses, too many financial transactions, too many grieving families demanding answers. The killings of Delphine Downing and her child in Michigan had already raised the stakes, but Jeanne Fay's case was different. Her disappearance was noticed almost immediately, and the people who knew her were unwilling to accept the vague explanations that Raymond and Martha had left behind. When Jeanne was last seen alive, she had been in her own home in Albany, New York. Neighbors remembered a well-dressed man and a heavy-set woman visiting her, claiming to be relatives. Her friends recalled that she seemed happy but somewhat distracted in her final days, mentioning that she might be marrying soon. When she suddenly stopped attending church and failed to answer letters, concern turned into alarm. One friend, suspecting foul play, contacted the police and provided them with a physical description of Jeanette's recent visitors. That description matched nearly perfectly with reports from Michigan and from at least 2 other states. Slowly, the web tightened. Albany detectives began working with Michigan State Police, who were already piecing together details from the Downing case. They learned that in both situations, the couple had vanished right after their host was last seen, taking personal items and draining bank accounts. What had once been regarded as isolated crimes now bore the unmistakable fingerprints of serial predation. By this time, Raymond and Martha were no longer operating cautiously. The double murder in Michigan and the killing of Jean Fay had rattled their routine. They abandoned their usual slow-burn courtship of victims and began moving from place to place more erratically. In late February 1949, they traveled to Grand Rapids, Michigan, attempting to blend into a small community where they hoped the shadow of their crimes would not follow. But they underestimated how quickly their faces and descriptions were spreading. The break came when a landlord, suspicious of the couple renting one of his apartments, contacted the police. The man fit the description of a wanted suspect seen in a bulletin circulated between law enforcement agencies. The woman matched too, same build, same features, same brusque demeanor. When officers arrived to question them, they found inconsistencies in their answers. Raymond claimed they were traveling siblings looking for work. Martha, flustered, gave a slightly different story about visiting relatives. The officers, sensing something amiss, detained them for further questioning. At first, Raymond tried to maintain his calm, denying any involvement in crimes and insisting they were victims of mistaken identity. Martha, however, began to unravel almost immediately under the pressure of interrogation. She had long been fiercely loyal to Raymond, even protective to the point of violence, but now confronted with the possibility of a long prison sentence or worse, she began to waver. In separate interviews, the cracks in their stories widened. Detectives confronted them with the evidence from the Downing case, the letters Raymond had written to Delphine, the bank withdrawals, the witness statements placing them at her home. Then came the details from the Fay investigation, the witnesses, the financial records, and the fact that Gunness' body had been found wrapped in blankets and hidden in the basement of a Long Island house that the couple had recently occupied. Faced with mounting evidence, Martha began to talk. Her confession was fragmented, emotional, and self-serving, but it contained enough truth to corroborate what investigators already suspected. She admitted that she and Raymond had been working together for years, using Lonely Hearts ads to lure women into relationships for financial gain. She portrayed herself not as an equal partner in murder, but as a jealous lover forced into terrible situations by Raymond's manipulations. Detectives, however, saw through much of this, especially when some of her own statements contradicted earlier claims. Raymond, for his part, was less willing to give ground. He maintained an air of superiority during questioning, sometimes smirking, sometimes deflecting, but eventually even he began to concede certain facts. He admitted to knowing both Delphine and Jeanne, and to traveling with Martha under assumed names. He stopped short of outright confessing to murder, but the circumstantial evidence was becoming overwhelming. News of their arrest spread quickly through the press, and soon the public was devouring every detail of the so-called Lonely Hearts killers. The nickname stuck, cementing their place in the annals of American criminal history. The idea of a couple traveling together, seducing and killing lonely women, fascinated and horrified readers in equal measure. For law enforcement, however, the media frenzy posed a new challenge, making sure the pair was tried for their crimes without jeopardizing the case through sensational coverage. The investigation continued for weeks, as police from multiple states came forward with potential links between the couple and unsolved cases. Old missing persons files were reopened. Bank records were scrutinized. Survivors of earlier encounters, women who had met Raymond through Lonely Hearts ads but had not been killed, were tracked down to give statements. Many described eerily similar experiences: the quick charm, the stories of stability and affection, the sudden financial requests, and the creeping sense that something was terribly wrong. By March 1949, prosecutors in New York were preparing to charge the pair with first-degree murder in Jean Fay's case, while Michigan authorities were building their own case for the Downing murders. The sheer weight of evidence, combined with their own contradictory statements, meant that Raymond and Martha had little chance of walking free. Their arrest was not the result of a dramatic chase or an undercover sting. It was the slow, steady work of investigators who refused to let the pattern slip through their fingers. As they were led from the police station in handcuffs, surrounded by flashing cameras and shouting reporters, the couple cut an odd figure. Raymond, still slick in his appearance, tried to maintain composure, while Martha scowled and snapped at anyone who came too close. It was the end of their life on the road, the end of the Lonely Hearts scam, and the beginning of a trial that would shock the country. The trial of Raymond Fernández and Martha Beck began in the spring of 1949, and from the moment the jury was selected, it was clear that this would not be a quiet affair. The press had turned them into macabre celebrities, labeling them the Lonely Hearts killers and printing lurid details about their lives, real or imagined. Every day, courtrooms filled to capacity with reporters, curious onlookers, and even people who had traveled from other states simply to witness the spectacle. In an era when murder trials could grip the public like serialized drama, this one had everything: romance, betrayal, and violence, wrapped in the unlikely package of a traveling brother and sister act. From the start, the prosecution built its case around the murder of Jean F.A. They argued that the killing had been premeditated, motivated by financial gain, and carried out with calculated coldness. Witnesses were called to the stand who described seeing Raymond and Martha with Jean in the days before her disappearance. Bank clerks testified about suspicious withdrawals. Neighbors recounted hearing arguments in Jeanette's home, followed by an eerie silence. And then there was the evidence of how her body was found, wrapped in blankets, hidden away, and showing unmistakable signs of strangulation. The prosecution also used the Downing murders in Michigan to paint a fuller picture of the couple's methods and mindset, even though those crimes were outside the jurisdiction of the New York court. They wanted the jury to see a pattern: the lonely hearts ads, the promises of love, the quick access to victims' finances, and the sudden violent endings. The defense, meanwhile, tried to distance Martha from the actual killings, portraying her as a manipulated woman under Raymond's psychological control. They argued that she was hopelessly in love and willing to do anything to keep him, even if it meant tolerating or covering up his crimes. Martha herself took the stand and spoke with raw emotion, alternately weeping and lashing out at the prosecution. She insisted that her role had been limited, that she had never planned a murder, and that her jealousy had driven her to acts of desperation rather than cold-blooded violence. Raymond, in contrast, was far less sympathetic. His testimony was marked by arrogance and a strange pride in his ability to seduce women. At times, he seemed more interested in controlling the courtroom as perception of him than in saving his own life. He admitted to deceit and theft but stopped short of admitting murder. Instead, he attempted to portray the killings as accidents or acts committed under emotional strain, deflecting direct responsibility whenever possible. But the jury was not swayed. The sheer volume of evidence, the corroborating witness statements, and the undeniable similarities between multiple cases made it impossible to accept the idea that either of them was simply a bystander. The image of a couple traveling together, preying on the lonely and vulnerable, had burned itself into the public consciousness and into the minds of the jurors. After a relatively short deliberation, the verdict was announced: guilty of first-degree murder. Both Raymond and Martha were sentenced to death by electrocution. It was a rare outcome for a woman at the time, and the decision made headlines across the country. Appeals were filed but rejected, and in March 1951, the pair were executed at Sing Sing Prison in New York. Reports from the time noted that Raymond remained calm to the end, while Martha appeared defiant, even contemptuous, as she faced the electric chair. Their deaths closed the chapter on one of America's most infamous criminal duos, but the story lingered in the public imagination. The Lonely Hearts Killers became a cautionary tale about trust, desire, and the dangers of believing in love without question. And yet, the notion of using romance as a lure for murder was far from unique to Raymond and Martha. In fact, decades earlier, a woman in the small town of Porte, Indiana, had perfected the deadly art of blending courtship with calculated killing. She didn't just charm her victims, she married them, welcomed them into her home, and made sure they never left alive. Her name was Belle Gunness, and the world would come to know her as the Lady Bluebeard of Porte. In the early years of the 20th century, the town of Porte, Indiana, was a quiet farming community where life moved slowly and neighbors knew each other's names. The streets were lined with modest houses, the kind where porches creaked under the weight of rocking chairs and people left their doors unlocked. It was the kind of place where gossip traveled faster than the mail, where any stranger drew curious glances, and where widows often receive both sympathy and the watchful eyes of the townsfolk. Yet even in such a small, tight-knit place, there were people who kept secrets too large to imagine hiding in plain sight. Belle Gunness was one of those people. To those who met her, she was an imposing figure, not in a glamorous way but in sheer physical presence. Standing nearly 6 feet tall and weighing close to 200 pounds, she was a woman who could handle a farm's heavy labor without flinching. She had a thick Norwegian accent and a matter-of-fact manner that could be read as confidence or brusqueness, depending on the listener. When she spoke, she commanded attention, and when she smiled rarely it was more of a polite acknowledgment than a display of warmth. Belle had come to La Porte in the early 1900s, already widowed and with children to care for. She bought a farm on the outskirts of town, a sizable property with fertile fields, a barn, and a sturdy farmhouse. For a single woman in those days, owning and managing such a property was unusual, and it quickly became part of her mystique. People admired her work ethic and independence, though some whispered about her luck. After all, she had been left with a decent sum of money from her late husband's life insurance, a tragic windfall, some might have said, and now seemed to live more comfortably than most women in her situation. At first, Belle's life in La Porte seemed unremarkable. She sold milk and eggs, tended to her children, and maintained her land. But there was something about the farm that drew both curiosity and unease. Visitors noted that Belle often kept to herself, that she was protective, almost possessive about certain parts of her property. She rarely let anyone wander near the hog pen, for instance, and when neighbors asked about the frequent digging they saw, she brushed it off with a vague explanation about drainage work or planting new crops. Over the years, Belle began to place small advertisements in Norwegian language newspapers across the Midwest. The ads were simple but enticing: a prosperous widow seeking a gentleman of means, someone serious about marriage, someone willing to join her on her farm and share in the life she had built. In those days, Lonely Hearts ads were not unusual, especially for immigrants looking for companionship within their own language and culture. Many widows and widowers used them to find partners, and many genuine romances began that way. Belle's ads, however, were different, not in tone, but in intent. When men answered her ads, they were invited to correspond with her. Letters would go back and forth for weeks, sometimes months, during which Belle presented herself as hard-working, affectionate, and ready to build a secure future. She would often hint carefully at the financial stability she could offer, but she also suggested that her suitor should bring a small investment to help improve the farm. This, she explained, would be their joint start in life together. Eventually, the most promising of these men were invited to La Porte. Belle would suggest they bring all their savings with them, preferably in cash, to make the transition smoother. She would meet them at the train station, sometimes accompanied by one of her children, and lead them to her farmhouse. Neighbors would see them arrive, usually well-dressed, with a suitcase or satchel, and then, curiously, never see them leave. When asked later, Belle would offer plausible explanations. The man had decided to go west for better opportunities. He had not been what she was looking for, or, in some cases, he had simply moved on after realizing they weren't a match. For a while, no one questioned these disappearances too deeply. Transience was not uncommon. At the time, people came and went in search of work, especially unmarried men. But there were small signs that something wasn't right. Suitors who wrote regularly to family before meeting Belle suddenly went silent. Bank accounts were empty, and Belle herself seemed to be making improvements to her farm, adding livestock, repairing the barn, and occasionally paying off debts with money no one quite knew the source of. By 1907, the rumors had grown louder. Some in town joked that Belle must have a gold mine hidden under her property, Others suggested that she was simply a shrewd businesswoman. But there were darker whispers too quietly exchanged between neighbors who recalled that Bella's first husband had died under strange circumstances, as had her second. Both deaths had resulted in life insurance payouts, and both men had been healthy before suddenly falling ill. In the second case, her husband's death came just one day after Belle had purchased a new life insurance policy on him. Still, Belle had a way of deflecting suspicion. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew her place in the community and dared anyone to challenge her. When local gossip grew too pointed, she might make a show of generosity, donating food to a struggling neighbor or helping a widow with farm chores. And then, just as quickly, she would retreat back to her guarded, private life. The real truth of Belle Gunness's farm was hidden in plain sight. Beneath the rich Indiana soil, among the rows of crops and the muddy stretch behind the hog pen, lay the remains of the men who had answered her letters and walked willingly into her home. She had perfected the art of the trap, lure them with the promise of love and partnership, gain their trust, take their money, and then make sure they would never have the chance to change their mind. In time, the scale of her crimes would shock even the most hardened investigators. But in the early years, Belle seemed untouchable. The missing men were simply names in letters, faces glimpsed at the train station, and vague stories told by a woman who always seemed to be telling the truth at least. The kind of truth no one wanted to question. What no one in La Porte could yet imagine was just how many graves lay hidden on that quiet farm, and how one terrible event of fire would turn Belle Gunness from a respected widow into one of the most notorious murderers in American history. By 1907, Belle Gunness had lived in La Porte for several years, and on the surface, she had carved out the image of a respectable, if somewhat aloof, farm widow. She was known for her physical strength, her ability to manage a property without a man's help, and her willingness to invest in her land and livestock. People in town might not have described her as warm, but they acknowledged her competence. Yet beneath this cultivated image, something unsettling was beginning to take root. The first hints of unease didn't come from the men who answered her ads. Most of them simply vanished, leaving no one in La Porte to speak on their behalf but from their families hundreds of miles away. A sister in Wisconsin, a brother in Kansas, a grown son in Minnesota, they all began to write letters and place calls to the La Porte post office, inquiring after their missing loved ones. Many of these relatives had received letters from the men shortly before their departure, filled with excitement about meeting Belle, describing her farm, and even outlining plans for marriage. And then, without warning, the correspondence stopped. One such case involved a man named Ole Budsberg, a Norwegian immigrant from Wisconsin. He had left home in 1907, telling his sons he was going to visit a wealthy widow in Indiana who was interested in marrying him. He never returned. His sons wrote to Belle, politely asking if she had seen their father. She responded with a short, curt letter, claiming that Ole had left her farm to travel elsewhere, and that she had no idea where he had gone. The explanation sounded plausible enough, but it didn't match the pattern of regular letters Ole had been sending before he met her. His sons remained uneasy, but without concrete evidence, there was little they could do. Similar stories began to emerge. Each man had brought money with him, sometimes hundreds or even thousands of dollars, under the pretense of investing in the farm or starting a new life. Each man had been in contact with Belle through letters before arriving, and each man had disappeared shortly afterward. It wasn't unusual for people to move or lose touch in those days, but what made these cases troubling was the consistency of the circumstances. Still, there was no law against being unlucky in love, and Belle continued to carry herself with the calm assurance of someone who knew she couldn't be easily questioned. Locally, small moments began to catch the attention of her neighbors. A hired hand once mentioned seeing Belle in the middle of the night, working in the hog pan with a shovel and a lantern. Another neighbor recalled that Belle seemed to have a habit of burning large bonfires in her yard for no clear reason, sometimes late into the evening. When asked, she would shrug and say she was getting rid of rubbish. People accepted these answers because they wanted to. After all, Belle was a woman alone with children. Why assume anything more sinister? At the same time, Belle's personal life provided its own distractions for the townsfolk. She had married again, briefly, to a man named Peter Gunness, who had died within a week of their wedding under circumstances that made even her most charitable neighbors raise an eyebrow. Peter was reportedly killed when a meat grinder fell from a high shelf and struck him in the head, a bizarre accident that seemed almost too unlikely to believe. The coroner at the time called the death suspicious, but with no hard evidence, the matter was closed. Belle collected on his life insurance and returned to her routine. Yet Peter's death left its mark. His teenage daughter, who had been living on the farm, told a friend that she feared for her life around Belle. Not long afterward, the girl was sent to stay with relatives and survived. Whether Peter had begun to suspect something about his new wife will never be known, but it's clear that he didn't have much time to find out. The turning point in public perception came when a man named Andrew Helgeline from South Dakota vanished after answering one of Belle's ads. His brother, Assel, was a persistent man, and he wasn't willing to accept vague explanations. Andrew had withdrawn a large sum of money before traveling to La Porte, and Assel suspected Belle was the last person to see him. He began writing her directly, demanding to know where Andrew was. Belle responded with carefully worded letters, suggesting that Andrew had decided to leave her farm unexpectedly, but Assel didn't believe it. When his demands for answers went unanswered, he began making plans to travel to Indiana himself. Assel's determination would prove to be a dangerous problem for Belle. For years, she had operated without serious interference. Men came, men disappeared, and life in La Porte went on. But now there was someone willing to connect the dots, someone who wouldn't be placated by polite denials. And Belle, for all her confidence, knew that the wrong kind of attention could bring everything crashing down. It was during this period that her behavior became more erratic. She was seen making large purchases of lye and cement. She sold off certain livestock abruptly, as though raising cash quickly. Some neighbors noticed she seemed tense, distracted, as if weighing some private calculation. And then came the most curious development of all. She hired a new farmhand, a man named Raymond. Ray was rough around the edges, with a checkered past, but Belle seemed to keep him close. Rumors began to swirl about the nature of their relationship. Some said he was infatuated with her, others claimed she used him for physical labor and little else. Whatever the truth, his arrival at the farm coincided with a new, watchful tension in Belle's life. By early 1908, the questions surrounding Belle Gunness were no longer whispers. There was an unspoken sense that something was off about the widow on the edge of town. Yet no one could have imagined the scale of what was buried on her land, nor the strange and violent way in which her story would come to light. All it would take was one night, one terrible fire to turn suspicion into a full-blown nightmare, and to reveal that La Porte's most self-sufficient widow had been living atop a graveyard of her own AKING. It was the early hours of April 28, 1908, when the night sky over La Porte was torn apart by the glow of flames. The Gunness farmhouse, usually a dark silhouette at the edge of town, was now lit up like a beacon, the fire consuming it from within. Neighbors, roused from sleep by the distant war and the acrid scent of smoke, hurried to the scene. Some came running in night clothes, others hitched their horses and wagons, But by the time they arrived, the fire had already gained a deadly hold. The heat was intense, driving the onlookers back even as they tried to approach. The wooden walls crackled and splintered, windows shattered in bursts of sparks, and the roof began to cave in, sending up showers of embers that drifted into the night air. For a few desperate minutes, people shouted Belle's name. They called for her children. They looked for any sign of movement inside. But there was no response, only the deep, muffled roar of the blaze and the hiss of collapsing beams. Some swore they saw a figure at an upstairs window just before the roof gave way, but whether it was Belle, one of her children, or nothing more than the flicker of firelight, no one could say. By dawn, the farmhouse was nothing more than a smoldering ruin, the air thick with the scent of charred wood and something far more unsettling, burned flesh. When the embers cooled enough for investigators to move in, the grim work of sifting through the debris began. It didn't take long to find the first body, a woman's torso, headless, badly burned, lying where the kitchen would have been. Nearby, the small remains of 3 children were uncovered, all positioned close together, as if they had been sleeping when the fire broke out. The absence of the woman's head was immediately suspicious, and speculation began to swirl even before the remains were identified. Could it be Belle? If so, why the missing head? And if it wasn't Belle, whose body was it? The mystery deepened with the discovery of footprints in the soft earth around the ruins. Some led toward the road, others toward the fields. And then there was Raymond, for the farmhand Belle had recently taken in, who appeared in town the morning after the fire, disheveled and agitated. He was quickly taken into custody, accused of setting the blaze. Lamfer admitted to being near the farm that night but denied starting the fire. Instead, he claimed Belle had been afraid for her life in recent weeks. According to him, she believed someone was coming to kill her, possibly Assel Helgeline, who was still looking for his missing brother. Belle had allegedly spoken of making arrangements to protect herself and her children, though Lamfer's account was scattered and inconsistent. The investigation turned into something far larger when the sheriff decided to search the property beyond the burned house. He began with the hog pen, an area neighbors had always found curious. Using shovels and probing rods, the men began to dig and almost immediately struck something soft, something that wasn't earth. The first peek yielded burlap bundles. Inside were human remains, bones, hair, and scraps of clothing. The stench was overpowering. As the work continued, more pits were uncovered, each containing the dismembered remains of different individuals. Some bodies were whole, others were cut into pieces. Word spread quickly, and by afternoon, the once quiet farm was surrounded by a crowd. People from Porte and nearby towns gathered to watch the gruesome recovery. Mothers pulled their children close, men shook their heads in disbelief, and everyone whispered the same question: how long had this been going on? The answer came in fragments as more remains surfaced. Some were believed to be the missing suitors whose families had been searching for them for years. Others could not be identified at all. The number of victims grew by the hour, and with each new discovery, though Gunness's reputation transformed from that of a hard-working widow to something monstrous. The body count eventually reached at least a dozen, though some estimates were far higher. Many of the victims were men who had answered her Lonely Hearts ads, but others appeared to be women and even children. What united them was the methodical way they had been buried, wrapped, dismembered, and placed in shallow graves. It was clear this had not been a crime of passion or impulse. It had been a system, a pattern Belle had perfected over years. Yet the most unsettling mystery of all remained. Was Belle Gunness herself among the dead? The headless woman found in the ruins was roughly her size. But without the head, positive identification was difficult. Some locals swore it wasn't her, that Belle had faked her death, using the fire as a cover to escape with whatever money she had left. Others argued she must have been the victim of revenge, perhaps killed by one of the many people she had wronged. As the days passed, the search of the farm became almost archaeological, with investigators and volunteers combing through every inch of soil. Personal items surfaced: a man's pocket watch, a wedding ring, bits of clothing. Each artifact was a clue to another life that had ended here. Letters were found as well, some of them drafts of Belle's correspondence to her suitors, all bearing the same manipulative tone: promises of love and partnership, veiled requests for money, and careful instructions for the men to bring all they could when they came. Meanwhile, Ray Lamfer remained in custody, alternately protesting his innocence and offering cryptic statements about Belle's plans. He claimed she had spoken of disappearing, of starting over somewhere far away. He even hinted that she had enemies in Porte, people who might want her gone. Whether these were the ramblings of a desperate man or fragments of the truth was impossible to know. By the time the digging stopped, the farm had yielded enough horror to cement Belle Gunness's place in criminal history. The neat, guarded widow had been living atop a killing field, her victims lured not by brute force but by trust, love, and greed. Yet her ultimate fate remained uncertain. Had she died in the fire, her reign of terror ending in flames? Or had she walked away under cover of the smoke, leaving behind a charred body and a trail of unanswerable questions? For the people of Porte, the only certainty was that their town would never again be the quiet, safe place it had once seemed. In the days and weeks after the fire, Porte was no longer a quiet farming town. It had become the epicenter of one of the most sensational manhunts in early 20th century America. The charred ruins of Belle Gunness's farmhouse were cordoned off, but that didn't stop curious onlookers from picking through the blackened timbers, pocketing scraps of wood, bits of porcelain, or even soil from the hog pen as macabre souvenirs. Reporters arrived from Chicago, St. Louis, and even as far as New York, their cameras snapping photographs of the empty foundation and the yawning pits where bodies had been unearthed. Every day brought fresh headlines, each more lurid than the last. Porte widow's farm yields 13th body. Is Belle still alive? Lady Bluebeard of Indiana. The official investigation faced a challenge almost as large as the scale of the crimes, proving whether Belle Gunness had truly perished in the fire. The headless body found in the ruins was sent for examination, and local doctors tried to estimate its height and weight based on the remaining bones and tissues. The measurements were close to Belle's reported size, but not conclusive. More troubling was the matter of the missing head. It was nowhere to be found, and without it, dental records or visual confirmation were impossible. Rumors began to swirl that the headless corpse might have been another victim altogether, perhaps a housekeeper or hired woman Belle had lured in to serve as a stand-in for her own death. Theories multiplied with every passing day. Some claimed Belle had slipped away in the chaos, perhaps with the help of Ray Lamfer, leaving behind just enough of a scene to convince the authorities she had died. Others believed she had been murdered by an angry suitor or one of the relatives of her victims, her body deliberately mutilated to delay identification. There were even whispers that she had planned the entire thing months in advance, selling off assets, stockpiling cash, and arranging for a substitute body to take her place in the fire. Ray Lamfer, locked away in the Porte jail, became the focal point for much of the public's curiosity. He was charged with arson and murder, accused of setting the fire that destroyed the farmhouse and killed Belle and her children. Lamfer denied killing anyone but admitted he had been near the property that night. His defense rested on a strange and settling claim. Belle had feared she was about to be arrested or attacked, and she had spoken of getting away before trouble reached her doorstep. Lamfer said she had been packing valuables, hiding money, and making cryptic arrangements in the weeks before the blaze. To some, this was the rambling of a guilty man trying to deflect blame. To others, it was a tantalizing glimpse into Belle's final days and possible escape. The sheriff and his deputies began to chase down reported sightings of Belle. Letters poured in from across the country. Farmers, shopkeepers, and travelers swore they had seen a woman matching her description. She was spotted in Chicago boarding a train, in San Francisco walking along the docks, even in New York wearing a black veil and speaking in a heavy Norwegian accent. One witness in Minnesota claimed she had been living under another name, working in a boarding house. None of these sightings could be confirmed, but each one kept the story alive and the public enthralled. The search also extended into Belle's past. Investigators contacted towns in Illinois, Minnesota, and Wisconsin where she had lived before moving to Porte. In nearly every place, rumors emerged about men who had disappeared after associating with her or suspicious insurance claims she had made. Her life story began to look less like a sudden descent into murder and more like a long, calculated progression. It became clear that Belle had been using the Lonely Hearts ads and personal connections to lure in wealthy or desperate men for years, her Laporte farm simply being the final stage of her operation. Meanwhile, the gruesome work on the farm continued. The hog pen yielded more remains, some so badly decomposed they could not be identified even by relatives of missing men. Jewelry, watches, and personal trinkets were collected and laid out in rows for viewing by potential claimants. Families traveled from multiple states, hoping for closure but often leaving with only more questions. Each new discovery seemed to confirm the same terrible truth. Belle Gunness had been far more prolific than anyone had guessed, her victim count possibly reaching into the dozens. By late summer, the frenzy began to subside, but the central question remained unanswered. Was Belle dead, or had she vanished into the world to begin again? Without the head, without clear proof, the case could not be closed. Lanfer was eventually convicted of arson but acquitted of murder, a verdict that satisfied almost no one. He would die in prison a few years later, still insisting Belle had escaped. In his final statements, he described her as cunning, manipulative, and entirely without remorse, a woman who could smile as she measured out poison or wielded a butcher's knife. The hunt for Belle became one of those American legends that lived on long after the newspapers moved on. People claimed to see her for decades afterward, an older woman in a small-town shop, a farmhand's widow living quietly under another name, a mysterious traveler who avoided giving her address. Whether these were genuine encounters or the products of imagination hardly mattered. Belle Gunness had achieved a kind of immortality, not through fame or beauty, but through fear. For Laporte, the story never truly ended. The land where her farmhouse once stood became a morbid curiosity, visited by strangers and whispered about by children. Even as the grass grew back over the pits and the hog pen fell into disrepair, the memory of what had been uncovered there lingered. And for those who had lost family to Belle's deceit, the unanswered question of her fate was the cruelest one of all. If she had died in that fire, then justice had been served by accident. But if she had lived, if she had walked away under the cover of smoke, then she had succeeded in the most chilling way possible, disappearing into the world free to charm and kill again. As the years passed, the fire at the Gunness farm faded from front-page headlines to the deeper pages of history, but the legend of Belle Gunness only grew stronger. In small towns across America, her name became shorthand for female deceit and calculated murder. Cautionary tale mothers told their daughters about trusting strangers, and a ghost story fathers told their sons about the dangers of chasing love without thinking. Even those who didn't know the exact details of her crimes seemed to know the outline. A widow who lured men with promises of marriage, then buried them beneath her hog pen. But legends have a strange way of mutating, And soon Belle's story began to attract shadows of its own crimes that bore her signature but weren't hers, women accused of similar schemes, and men who claimed to have narrowly escaped her grasp. Newspapers in other states began to report Belle-like murders, a wealthy widower poisoned after marrying a younger woman, a boarder in a rural inn vanishing without a trace after paying several months' rent in advance, a pair of lovers found dead in circumstances that hinted at greed as much as passion. Some of these cases had nothing to do with Belle. Others, disturbingly, involved women who openly admitted to admiring her methods. One particularly unsettling case surfaced in the 1910s when police in another Midwestern town arrested a woman named Anna Peterson. She had been corresponding with men through personal ads, asking them to bring large sums of money and valuables before meeting her. Several of those men disappeared, and while no bodies were found on her property, investigators discovered burned clothing, personal effects, and letters eerily similar in tone to Belle's. Anna claimed she had never even heard of Belle Gunness, but the public was quick to dub her the Gunness of Iowa, sealing her fate in the court of opinion long before her trial began. Relaxing's prison death had only added fuel to the speculation about Belle's possible survival. In his final weeks, he told the minister that Belle had escaped the fire and was living under a new identity. According to Lampher, she had taken a large sum of cash and jewelry, fled the state, and might have even left the country. No one could confirm the story, but the idea was irresistible, especially when scattered, unverified reports of her surfaced in different places. In 1914, a woman in Mississippi was arrested on suspicion of being Belle, but she turned out to be someone else entirely. In 1931, a retired detective swore that he had seen her in Los Angeles, running a boarding house. Even in the 1950s, there were letters to local papers claiming she had been spotted in Canada. The myth had taken on a life of its own, and with it came imitators, both intentional and accidental. Lonely heart stings became a recurring crime trend in the early 20th century, as newspapers and classified ads offered fertile hunting grounds for swindlers. Men and women alike used romantic promises to lure in victims, often with financial motives. Some were simple scams, extracting money without any intent to meet. Others turned violent, echoing Belle's more sinister legacy. Law enforcement agencies, now more aware of the potential dangers of such ads, began to monitor them more closely, but in many rural communities, oversight was minimal at best. La Porte itself became something of a morbid pilgrimage site for true crime enthusiasts long before that term existed. Visitors came to see the place where the farmhouse had once stood, often leaving disappointed when they found only open land. A few locals claimed to have pieces of brick or wood from the ruins, selling them quietly to those willing to pay. Others told embroidered stories about Belle's ghost haunting the hog pen, wandering at night in a blood-stained dress, carrying a lantern in one hand and a severed head in the other. It was nonsense, of course, but it kept the legend alive in a town that would otherwise have faded into anonymity. In a way, Belle's crimes had planted seeds that grew into an enduring cultural fascination with the Black Widow archetype, a woman who kills for profit, masking her cruelty behind charm and domesticity. She was invoked in crime novels, whispered about in pulp magazines, and even served as loose inspiration for characters in early films. Her story fit neatly into the public's simultaneous fear and fascination with dangerous women, especially in an era when women were expected to be passive, nurturing, and dependent. Belle had been none of those things. What made her case all the more disturbing was the thought that she might have been alive to watch her own legend grow. If she had survived the fire, she could have read the newspaper accounts, seen her name in bold letters, and known that the world believed her dead. For someone as cunning as Belle, that knowledge would have been intoxicating. She could have been sitting in a boarding house parlor drinking tea and smiling to herself as she listened to strangers discuss the Gunness woman without realizing they were speaking about the person sitting just a few feet away. By the 1920s, the direct investigation into Belle's fate had gone cold, but her name continued to resurface whenever a similar crime occurred. Even seasoned detectives found themselves comparing cases to hers, looking for patterns in the victims, the methods, and the motivations. Whether consciously or not, other killers had learned from her example. The lonely hearts ads, the quick marriages, the sudden disappearances, and the disposal of bodies in ways that made recovery and therefore proof difficult. For the families of her victims, the persistence of the legend was a cruel kind of immortality. Each time Belle's name came up in the papers, they were reminded not just of her but of the loved ones they had lost to her greed and deception. Closure was impossible while the question of her death remained unanswered. And as long as that question lingered, Belle Gunness could never truly be consigned to the past. It is perhaps this unfinished nature of her story that made it so potent, so able to inspire fear decades after the farmhouse burned to the ground. In every unsolved disappearance, in every suspicious death of a newlywed husband, there was a whisper of her methods. Whether she was alive or not, Belle's shadow stretched far beyond La Porte, touching lives and shaping crimes she would never personally commit. And it is here amid the echo of her deeds and the chilling possibility that she lived out her days under a false name that we see how one criminal's legacy can ripple outward for generations. Because the story of Belle Gunness is not just about the bodies buried in a hog pen, it is about the ones who saw her blueprint and decided to follow it. By the time 2 decades had passed since the fire, Belle Gunness had become more than a figure from the past. She was a measuring stick for evil, a benchmark against which other similar crimes were compared. In the minds of police detectives and newspaper editors, she was the template for a certain type of killer, the calculated seductress. The so-called Black Widow who didn't act in a fit of passion but in cold, deliberate pursuit of gain. And as the years wore on, it seemed that the echoes of her methods kept surfacing, sometimes eerily close to her own blueprint. One such case unfolded in the late 1920s when authorities in Missouri arrested a woman named Emma Schmidt. Schmidt had been running personal ads in rural newspapers, advertising herself as a widow seeking companionship and security. The phrasing was nearly identical to the Lonely Hearts notices Belle had used decades earlier. Men answered her letters and traveled to meet her, often bringing savings or personal property to start their supposed new life together. Several never returned home. When their families raised alarms, investigators discovered that Schmidt had pawned jewelry belonging to her suitors and sold off their livestock in quick succession. Digging further, both figuratively and literally, police unearthed 2 shallow graves behind her property. The cause of death for both men was poisoning. While Schmidt's crimes were smaller in scale than Belle's, the press pounced on the similarities, labeling her the Gunness of Missouri. The nickname wasn't just for shock value. It reflected the public's deep-seated belief that Belle's way of operating had become a criminal archetype. Some even speculated that Schmidt might have been a protege or at least inspired by the famous La Porte case. When questioned, Schmidt denied knowing anything about Belle Gunness, but her evasive smirk and the calculated nature of her crimes made that hard to believe. Another chilling echo came in 1932 in rural Ohio, when a woman named Louise Witherspoon was implicated in the deaths of 3 men who had all been her boarders at a small farm she owned. Each man had been last seen in her company, often after boasting to neighbors about the profitable venture they were starting together. Police later found that Witherspoon had taken control of their bank accounts and property through forged documents. Though no bodies were recovered, likely due to the property's proximity to a river, where evidence could be easily disposed of. The pattern of sudden disappearances and swift financial gain was too familiar to ignore. Detectives openly drew parallels to Belle Gunness, and once again the newspapers resurrected her name for sensational headlines. The recurrence of these cases suggested something unsettling. Belle's crimes had been studied, perhaps even admired, by a new generation of killers who understood the same psychological leverage she had wielded. Lonely hearts adds small-town isolation, the manipulation of trust and love. All of these factors could be exploited with minimal risk, especially in an era when communication between law enforcement agencies was slow and patchy. Without centralized criminal databases or instant background checks, a clever predator could move from state to state, leaving behind a trail of victims without immediate detection. For criminologists of the time, Belle's case became a point of study not just for its brutality, but for its efficiency. She had exploited the social norms of her era, when a woman's respectability was often assumed by default, and the private dealings between adults were rarely scrutinized unless scandal broke out. Even after her supposed death, the same societal blind spots allowed others to follow in her footsteps. Men were often reluctant to admit they had been deceived by a woman, and in some cases families preferred to quietly accept a disappearance rather than publicly acknowledge that their son or brother had been duped. This culture of silence gave fertile ground for other predators. In the late 1930s, an even more elaborate case emerged involving a pair of con artists, a man and a woman who traveled together under assumed names, running matrimonial ads to lure lonely, middle-aged bachelors. They would isolate the victim, drain his finances, and then vanish. In at least one instance, the victim was found dead under suspicious circumstances, though the couple escaped prosecution for lack of direct evidence. Observers noted that the female half of the duo bore an uncanny resemblance to old photographs of Belle Gunness, sparking rumors that she had somehow returned from the dead, operating under yet another alias. While these claims were almost certainly false, they added to the enduring myth that Belle had not only survived, but continued her crimes in new forms. Even law enforcement officers found themselves occasionally caught up in the speculation. Retired detectives gave interviews in which they recounted sightings of Belle decades after the fire. One insisted he had spoken to her in a small-town post office in 1935, noting her heavy accent and the way she avoided eye contact. Another claimed she had been living under the name Mrs. Anderson in a Scandinavian immigrant community in the Pacific Northwest. None of these accounts were ever confirmed, but they kept the idea alive that the woman behind one of the most infamous murder sprees in American history might still be out there, watching her legend grow. For the public, the question of Belle's fate became less about fact and more about the unsettling possibility that a person could commit such horrors and simply vanish. It played into a primal fear that evil doesn't always get caught, that sometimes it slips away quietly and reinvents itself. And as long as other killers adopted her methods, it was as if Belle Gunness had never truly left the stage. Her story wasn't just a chapter in criminal history, it was an ongoing influence, written and rewritten by those who came after her. By the time the mid-20th century rolled around, Belle's name was as much folklore as fact. She was a cautionary tale told in whispered tones, an example in criminology lectures, and a sensational footnote in true crime magazines. Yet, for all the retellings and reinventions, one thing never changed: the mystery of her final fate. The uncertainty was a wound that never healed for both her victims' families and the community of La Porte. And perhaps that was her greatest victory, if one can call it that. Not the money she took, nor the number of lives she ended, but the fact that she might have walked away into the smoke of her burning farmhouse, leaving behind a question mark so large that it would haunt generations. In the end, It was not just the bodies buried in the hog pen that secured Belle Gunness's place in history, but the idea that she could be anywhere, at any time, wearing a different face and a different name, yet still the same woman who had once ruled her lonely farm with charm, deceit, and death. As the decades rolled on, Belle Gunness's name refused to sink into the dust of forgotten crimes. Every few years, some stray report or dubious claim would surface, breathing life back into the embers of her story. These sightings ranged from the vague to the oddly specific, and each one was devoured by the public with the same mix of skepticism and morbid fascination. The uncertainty surrounding her fate was, in many ways, the lifeblood of her legend. If she had truly died in the fire, her story might have been sealed long ago. But because no one could say with absolute certainty that the remains found in that farmhouse belonged to her, the door to speculation remained wide open. One of the most enduring reports came from Los Angeles in 1931, when a woman named Esther Carlson was arrested on charges of poisoning an elderly man for financial gain. Carlson, who was in her 50s at the time, bore a striking resemblance to the surviving photographs of Belle, albeit older and heavier. When she was taken into custody, police found among her possessions a photograph of 3 children. The ages of the children and their features, some said, matched those of Belle's own children from La Porte. Carlson died in jail before she could stand trial, and with her death went any chance of confirming her true identity. Those who believed she was Belle clung to the photograph as proof, those who doubted pointed to the lack of hard evidence. Still, the Carlson theory became one of the most popular in the catalog of Belle Gunness sightings. Other reports were more elusive. In the late 1930s, a Norwegian immigrant in Chicago claimed to have recognized Belle working as a cook in a boarding house. He said he had known her years earlier, before she left Norway for America, and that her distinctive accent and mannerisms were unmistakable. Police investigated but found nothing by the time they arrived at the address he provided. The cook in question had left without notice, leaving behind no forwarding information. In another case, a traveling salesman swore he had met her in a small Montana town in the early 1940s, where she was running a modest roadside diner. He recalled her being unusually interested in his personal life, asking about his marital status, his property, and whether he had any troublesome relatives. It was the kind of probing that, in hindsight, sent a chill down his spine. These sightings fed into the belief that Belle had not only survived but had successfully built new lives for herself, perhaps multiple times. Some amateur sleuths theorized that she might have altered her appearance through surgery or simply let time do the work for her. Others speculated that she had used her wealth to bribe her way into new identities, possibly even acquiring legal documents under assumed names. The truth was, in an era before comprehensive identification systems, it was entirely possible for someone to disappear and reappear elsewhere with minimal risk of exposure, especially if they were careful, resourceful, and utterly without conscience. In La Porte, the fascination with Belle never truly faded. Old-timers told the story to newcomers as a sort of initiation into the town's darker history. Children dared each other to visit the site of the old Gunness farm at night, whispering that her ghost roamed the land, searching for her next victim. Local entrepreneurs occasionally tried to capitalize on the notoriety, selling postcards or hosting Belle Gunness tours, though these ventures rarely lasted long. The townspeople, while aware of the draw her name carried, also lived with the uneasy knowledge that their home would always be linked to one of the most infamous murder cases in American history. For law enforcement historians and criminologists, Belle's case remained a study in the interplay between fact and folklore. While the known details of her crimes were horrifying enough, it was the unanswered question of her fate that elevated her into a near-mythic figure. A murderer who vanished without confirmed death was a rarity, and in Belle's case, the ambiguity became the perfect canvas for theories. Some detectives believed she had died in the fire and that the charred remains belonged to her, arguing that the discrepancies in size and dental records were the result of poor documentation and the limitations of early forensic work. Others were convinced she had escaped, noting the reports of large cash withdrawals and the hurried sale of certain assets in the days before the fire. The passage of time only deepened the divide between believers and skeptics. Every new case of a woman accused of killing for profit seemed to reopen the wound. Headlines would reference Belle, comparing the new suspect to the Bluebeard of Porte as if she were a template for female criminality. Writers of true crime anthologies relished her story, often embellishing details or leaning heavily on the more lurid aspects of her alleged personality. The result was a portrait that was as much fiction as fact, though no less compelling. By the 1950s, the FBI's growing interest in criminal profiling included retrospective studies of notorious figures, and Belle's name was among them. Analysts noted her meticulous planning, her ability to manipulate social norms to her advantage, and her cold efficiency in disposing of bodies. They also remarked on her financial motivations, pointing out that unlike some killers driven by rage or impulse, Belle operated with the detachment of a business transaction. She killed when it was profitable, and stopped when it wasn't or when it became too risky. This, they argued, was part of why she might have chosen to disappear rather than continue her spree. Even into the latter half of the 20th century, sightings persisted. An unverified report placed her in Vancouver, Canada, living under the name Lizzie McDougall. Another claimed she was seen in a retirement community in Florida, an old woman with sharp eyes and a thick Scandinavian accent. None of these were ever confirmed, but each added a layer to the legend, ensuring that Belle Gunness remained in the public consciousness long after her supposed death. The truth, of course, may never be known. Whether she died in that fire or walked away into a new life, Belle Gunness left behind an unfinished story, one that straddles the line between history and mystery. It is this lack of closure that makes her tale endure. Because as long as there is doubt, there is the unsettling possibility that the woman who buried her victims under a hog pen could have lived out her days quietly, blending into the fabric of some unsuspecting community. And it is in this space between certainty and speculation that the legend thrives, influencing not just public imagination but the very real crimes of those who came after her. Because Belle Gunness was more than just a killer, she was a lesson, a warning, and to some, a perverse kind of inspiration. And perhaps most chillingly, she proved that sometimes the deadliest predator is the one you never see coming and may never catch. By the time the century turned, the story of Belle Gunness had transformed from a grim piece of Midwestern history into something larger, almost archetypal. She was no longer just a name on police blotters or in the yellowed pages of early 20th century newspapers. She had become a cautionary tale that threaded itself through generations, whispered in classrooms, retold in pulp magazines, and dissected in true crime documentaries. Yet despite decades of speculation, investigation, and retelling, her ending remained the one piece of the puzzle no one could fit into place with certainty. The inability to close her file left an uneasy void, the kind of gap in a story that makes it linger in the mind long after the facts have been recited. The official records were as definitive as they could be without certainty. On April 28, 1908, a fire consumed the Gunness farmhouse, and in the ruins authorities found the bodies of 3 children and a headless adult woman. The dental records, such as they were, suggested a possible match to Belle, but the size of the body, a full 6 inches shorter than Belle, was known to be cast a shadow of doubt. Still, for some in law enforcement, this was enough to close the case, to stamp deceased next to her name and move on. But others, both in the police ranks and in the public, could never shake the feeling that they were letting her slip away. The years that followed were filled with tantalizing fragments of possible truth. Witnesses claimed to have seen her boarding trains, stepping onto ships, or living quietly in towns scattered across the country. Each report carried just enough plausibility to keep the legend alive, but none had the irrefutable evidence that could bridge the gap between rumor and fact. Some claimed she had fled to her native Norway, where she could live anonymously among other Scandinavian immigrants. Others believed she had stayed closer to home, taking on new names, possibly even marrying again, reinventing herself as she had done before, only this time with the wisdom of someone who had already escaped once. Theories about her post-fire life varied widely. One popular version had her living in California, operating a boarding house for single men. In this telling, she never killed again, either because she no longer needed to or because she knew she was being watched. Another, darker theory suggested she continued her pattern of luring men with the promise of companionship, only to rob and dispose of them. Without a body to prove her death, either scenario could be true or neither could. That uncertainty was the story's heartbeat. For the families of her victims, closure was impossible. Many never recovered the remains of their loved ones, leaving them with nothing more than a name on a missing persons report and the grim knowledge that their relative had been part of something monstrous. The lack of a confirmed fate for Belle added insult to injury. If she had died in the fire, justice such as it was had been served by the flames. But if she had escaped, then she had stolen not only lives and fortunes, but also peace of mind, haunting her victims' families in a way that went far beyond the grave. By the mid-20th century, Belle's story had become a fixture in criminology lectures. She was held up as an example of a killer who understood the vulnerabilities of her time and exploited them to the fullest. In a society where women were often underestimated in matters of violence, Belle had used those assumptions as a weapon. She played the role of the grieving widow, the warm farm owner, the lonely but hopeful companion. And she did it so convincingly that men willingly traveled long distances, bringing their savings with them, and in some cases, even writing farewell letters to their families expressing optimism about the life they believed awaited them. The calculated nature of her crimes also ensured her place in criminal history. Belle was not a killer driven by sudden rage or unstable impulses. She was deliberate, patient, and methodical. She built trust, nurtured it, and then betrayed it when it was most advantageous for her. In doing so, she revealed an unsettling truth, that evil can be quiet, charming, and completely unremarkable on the surface. Those who knew her before the revelations often described her as practical, sometimes stern, but not overtly cruel. It was this ability to mask her intentions that made her so dangerous. Her legend was also fed by the fact that she operated in a transitional period for American law enforcement. Communication between jurisdictions was limited, forensic science was still in its infancy, and tracking a fugitive across state lines was often a matter of luck rather than procedure. Belle thrived in this environment. Had she lived a few decades later, with fingerprint databases and improved forensics, she might not have had the same opportunities or the same chance to disappear so completely. Even today, more than a century after the fire, Belle Gunness's name sparks a reaction. For some, it is a shiver of fascination; for others, the grim reminder that not all killers are caught and punished. Her story is retold in books, podcasts, and documentaries, often with some new evidence or discovery that promises to solve the mystery once and for all. Yet each time, the ending remains just out of reach. The truth about what happened to her, whether she died in that farmhouse or lived out her days in hiding, may never be known. And maybe that's why her story endures. It's not just the scale of her crimes or the brutality of her methods, but the possibility that she got away with it. In the realm of true crime, There are few things more unsettling than a predator who simply vanishes. Belle Gunness, whether dead or alive after April 1908, secured her place in history not only as a prolific killer but as a master of disappearing in plain sight. As the shadows of her legend stretch into the present, her tale becomes more than just a historical crime. It becomes a reminder of how much can hide behind a friendly smile and a firm handshake. And perhaps most chillingly, it forces us to confront the idea that sometimes the monsters in our midst are never truly gone. They just change their name, move to a new town, and start again.